Daniel and Isabella were the kind of couple everyone admired from afar, the kind of pair that made people whisper in awe and envy when they entered a room. To the world, they were perfection stitched together in human form, elegant, poised, and untouched by the storms of ordinary life. Daniel, a successful businessman with a kind of charm that could light up an entire ballroom, walked beside Isabella, a woman of grace who seemed born to wear pearls and silks. Together, they moved through society like a royal couple, adored for their wealth, their beauty, and their supposed love story. Guests at charity galas often found themselves unable to take their eyes off them, watching as they shared practiced smiles and subtle gestures that seemed like signs of intimacy. Their names appeared in glossy magazines, their home was featured in lifestyle spreads, and they seemed to embody everything one could dream of: power, prestige, and love. Their house itself was a marvel, a sprawling estate with marble floors that echoed softly beneath designer heels, a chandelier so grand it could rival the stars, and gardens where roses bloomed in perfect symmetry. Parties hosted by Isabella were the talk of the city, with guests sipping champagne as a string quartet played in the background. Daniel's hand would rest lightly on Isabella's back, guiding her through the crowd, while she dazzled their guests with warmth and elegance. To outsiders, theirs was a marriage of not only wealth but also unshakable devotion. They were the couple people secretly wished to become, the couple who seemed untouchable. But beneath the polished surface, the shine began to dull. Behind the closed doors of their mansion, silence often filled the grand halls. Daniel, once attentive and full of affection, now seemed consumed by his work, or at least that was what Isabella told herself when he came home late. He no longer noticed the little details she carefully curated, the way she set the table with his favorite crystal glasses, the new dress she wore to catch his eye, or the soft curls she styled just the way he used to love. He would nod, distracted, scrolling through his phone, answering emails, or locking himself away in his office with excuses of urgent meetings. His presence grew cold, a shadow of the man who once whispered promises of forever. Isabella, though admired by friends as the epitome of grace, felt the slow ache of loneliness hollowing her out. When she stood beside him in front of flashing cameras, she painted on a radiant smile, but her heart quietly longed for the warmth of his gaze, for the tenderness that had once defined their marriage. She told herself it was just a phase, that the stress of business weighed heavily on him, and that soon he would find his way back to her. Yet deep inside, she felt the distance growing like an invisible wall, one she didn't know how to break. Appearances, after all, were deceiving. The world saw perfection, but Isabella lived with the painful truth: her marriage was slipping away, and she was the only one who seemed to notice. Vanessa entered Daniel's life like a storm disguised as a gentle breeze. She was new at his company, introduced as a consultant brought in to manage a high-profile project that demanded sharp thinking and bold ideas. From the moment she walked into the boardroom, she commanded attention, not just with her flawless appearance but with the way she spoke, confident and unapologetic. Her long auburn hair framed a face that could hold both innocence and mischief, her eyes sharp yet inviting. She carried herself with the poise of someone who knew the power she held over people, and Daniel, already distracted by the void in his marriage, found himself drawn to her without even realizing it. What started as simple admiration of her professionalism quickly twisted into fascination, and that fascination was something Vanessa encouraged with every calculated glance and lingering smile. Vanessa was everything Isabella was not, or at least, that was how Daniel's mind began to paint the picture. Where Isabella was gentle and refined, Vanessa was daring and bold. She was unafraid to speak her mind, unafraid to challenge Daniel in meetings, unafraid to lean a little too close when discussing strategies late into the evening. She made him feel alive, like a man at the center of attention, desired and admired not for his wealth or social standing but for his charisma and power. She listened with intensity, laughing at his jokes, validating his frustrations, and feeding the part of his ego that craved constant praise. Isabella had once done the same, but years of marriage had settled into routines. With Vanessa, everything felt thrilling, new, and forbidden. Outside the office, Vanessa blurred boundaries even further. She would accidentally show up at the same high-end restaurant where Daniel was dining with clients, slipping him a teasing smile across the room. She found reasons to call him late at night under the guise of work, her voice soft and deliberate, dripping with unspoken suggestions. Daniel told himself it was harmless, that he was simply enjoying harmless flirtation, that he had no intention of crossing the line. But lines had a way of fading when temptation pressed hard enough. For Vanessa, this was not just an affair of the heart but a calculated ambition. She had studied men like Daniel, powerful, wealthy, yet quietly dissatisfied with their lives. She knew how to play the game, how to exploit the weaknesses of men who wanted to feel desired again. She wasn't content with being just an employee or a passing fling, she wanted more. She imagined herself stepping into Isabella's world, attending galas at Daniel's side, wearing jewels that sparkled under chandeliers, living in the mansion she had only seen in society pages. Every glance, every calculated word, every subtle touch was a step toward that fantasy. Daniel, however, lived in a constant push and pull. His conscience reminded him of Isabella, the woman who had stood by his side for years, the one who believed in him, who hosted his parties, who smiled through every challenge. But his desires pulled him toward Vanessa, toward the thrill of being wanted in a way that felt reckless and passionate. Nights at home became colder, his conversations with Isabella shorter, his excuses for working late more frequent. Isabella, graceful as ever, pretended not to notice, but deep inside, she felt the hollow space between them widening. And so, the stage was set, a wife clinging to the hope of love restored, and a mistress weaving her web with dangerous precision. Daniel was caught in the middle, blind to the destruction ahead, too enchanted by temptation to see the storm gathering on the horizon. Isabella had always been a woman of patience, a woman who carried her emotions with grace even when they threatened to crush her. She had built her life with Daniel on the foundation of trust, believing in the vows they exchanged on their wedding day, believing that love would be enough to see them through every trial. But lately, that belief felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap at the slightest pull. Each night she found herself waiting for Daniel to walk through the doors of their home, waiting for his familiar smile, waiting for the warmth of his hand on hers. More often than not, she was met with silence and disappointment, watching the clock tick past midnight while the dinner she had carefully prepared grew cold and untouched. She told herself he was busy, that his company demanded his time and energy, that this was just a season of sacrifice. But the evidence was hard to ignore. His late nights had become too frequent, his excuses too practiced, and his eyes, once full of affection, now held a distant glaze whenever they lingered on her. He no longer noticed the effort she poured into their life together. The gown she wore for their gala went uncomplimented. The way she styled her hair, hoping to catch his admiration, went unseen. The dinners she planned with his favorite dishes often ended with her sitting alone at the table, staring at the empty seat across from her. The loneliness gnawed at her. In public, she still wore the mask of perfection. She stood beside Daniel at social events, smiling for cameras, exchanging pleasantries with guests, and pretending that nothing was wrong. But inside, her heart ached with questions she could not ask. Was she no longer enough? Had she failed him in some unspoken way? Or was he simply drifting further into a world where she could no longer reach him? She replayed their early years in her mind, the way he used to surprise her with flowers, the way his laughter filled their home, the way he once made her feel like the most important woman in the world. Those memories felt like ghosts now, haunting her every time she looked at him and saw only distance. Isabella's pain was quiet, invisible to everyone but herself. She cried behind locked doors, her sobs muffled into pillows, careful never to let the staff or Daniel hear her brokenness. Even in her tears, she carried dignity, unwilling to let the world know how fragile she had become inside. She still hoped, still prayed that he would come back to her, that the man she had loved all these years would remember her worth. Yet, deep down, she sensed something was slipping beyond repair. Her silence was not weakness, it was survival. She chose not to confront him yet, not because she lacked courage, but because she was gathering strength, trying to understand the shape of her pain. She loved Daniel, but she also loved herself enough to recognize the hurt he was causing. And though she had not yet spoken the words aloud, a small, growing part of her knew. Love could not survive without respect, and her heart was beginning to wonder how much longer it could endure being unseen. Daniel had promised Isabella that he would be home early that evening. She had spent the afternoon preparing a dinner she hoped would rekindle the warmth that once bound them together. The dining table was set with precision, candles flickered in delicate holders, and a soft aroma of roasted herbs filled the air. Isabella even wore the dress Daniel had once called his favorite, a deep sapphire gown that brought out the glow in her eyes. She waited by the window, listening for the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. Minutes became hours, and as the candles burned lower, her heart sank further into silence. The phone stayed still, offering no reassurance, and she was left staring at untouched plates, her hope fading into quiet despair. Daniel, however, was nowhere near home. That night, he had allowed temptation to lead him straight into Vanessa's arms. She had invited him under the guise of discussing urgent project matters, but when he arrived at her luxurious apartment, there was no talk of business. The air was thick with perfume, the lights dimmed just enough to blur the lines of propriety. Vanessa welcomed him with a knowing smile, her voice soft and intoxicating as she offered him a drink. Their conversation was filled with playful banter, every word designed to peel away his defenses. For weeks, Daniel had teetered on the edge, convincing himself that his flirtation with her was harmless, that he was strong enough to resist. But in that moment, as her hand brushed against his and her eyes locked onto his with a hunger that promised excitement, he stopped fighting. What began as a stolen kiss soon spiraled into something irreversible. Vanessa knew exactly how to feed the fire. Her touch, her whispers, her boldness all contrasted with the growing emptiness Daniel felt at home. The guilt in his chest flickered for a moment, but it was quickly drowned by the intoxication of being desired so fiercely. Hours slipped away unnoticed as he surrendered to the forbidden, allowing himself to be consumed by a passion he knew would leave consequences in its wake. Back at the mansion, Isabella sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She tried to convince herself he was stuck in meetings, that his phone had died, that there was some reasonable explanation for his absence. She even forced herself to take small bites of the meal she had prepared, though the taste turned to ash in her mouth. The candles had burned nearly to their ends, dripping wax onto the pristine tablecloth, and the once warm dishes had grown cold. The silence of the vast house pressed against her, reminding her just how alone she had become. She glanced at the clock again, past midnight, and the sting of tears blurred her vision. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to admit defeat, but the ache in her chest was too much to contain. Daniel eventually left Vanessa's apartment, his tie loosened, his mind clouded with a mix of satisfaction and unease. As he drove back, he rehearsed excuses, lies he might tell if Isabella was awake. A meeting had run long, perhaps, or he had been too exhausted to call. He convinced himself she would accept it. After all, hadn't she always been forgiving? He told himself he deserved this one night, that it was just an escape, nothing more. But deep down, a part of him knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross. When he finally arrived home, the house was quiet, the lights dim. Isabella had fallen asleep on the couch, her head resting against a cushion, the sapphire dress wrinkled from hours of waiting. The untouched plates still sat on the table, the food spoiled, a silent reminder of her devotion and his betrayal. Daniel stood in the doorway, staring at her fragile figure, and for a fleeting second, guilt pierced him with unbearable clarity. But instead of waking her, instead of confessing, he quietly walked past, retreating into the shadows of his office as if hiding from the weight of what he had done. That night marked the true beginning of the unraveling, the moment when Daniel's secret life clashed against Isabella's silent loyalty. One lived in indulgence and denial, while the other suffered in love and loneliness. Neither yet knew how devastating the consequences of this night would be, but the cracks in their perfect facade had deepened beyond repair. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, when Isabella had not been searching for answers but simply trying to find comfort in routine. She was tidying Daniel's study, something she often did to feel closer to him when his presence had grown so rare. She straightened the bookshelves, dusted the desk, and gathered loose papers into neat stacks. That was when her hand brushed against his jacket, draped casually over the chair. She picked it up to hang it properly in the closet, but as she did, her eyes caught something tucked inside the breast pocket, a folded receipt from a luxury hotel across town. At first, she told herself it might have been for a meeting or a business dinner. Daniel often hosted clients in expensive places. But when she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. The bill listed 2 glasses of wine, a room number, and a charge for an overnight stay. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound roaring in her ears. She dropped the jacket back onto the chair, her hands trembling as though they no longer belonged to her. She tried to steady her breathing, to convince herself it could still be explained. Maybe it was an error, maybe the receipt wasn't his, maybe she was imagining the worst. But the neat signature at the bottom, Daniel's signature, erased every last fragment of denial. It felt as if the walls of the study closed in on her, pressing against her chest until she could hardly breathe. Isabella sat down in his chair, the leather cold beneath her. She clutched the receipt tightly in her hand, staring at it until the words blurred through her tears. She had suspected something was wrong for weeks, the late nights, the distracted excuses, the distance in his eyes. But seeing proof was a different kind of pain. This was not a suspicion anymore, it was betrayal carved in ink and paper. The man she had loved, the man she had defended to the world, had chosen another place, another woman, over her. The devastation coursed through her quietly, for even in heartbreak, Isabella refused to fall apart outwardly. She pressed her lips together to keep from crying out, from letting the grief consume her in uncontrollable sobs. Instead, she folded the receipt again, carefully, and tucked it back into the jacket pocket as though nothing had ever been touched. The evidence was there, but so was her resolve to carry it silently. For now. That night, when Daniel came home late yet again, Isabella greeted him with the same calm expression she always wore. She poured his drink, asked about his day, and listened to his rehearsed answers, all while her heart broke inside her chest. He didn't notice the redness around her eyes, nor the stiffness in her smile. He didn't see how her fingers clutched the edge of her glass, holding herself together in front of him. To him, nothing had changed. To her, everything had. In the solitude of her bedroom later that night, she finally allowed herself to cry. Her tears stained the pillow, her body trembling as she muffled the sounds so no one would hear. She wept not just for the betrayal but for the love she had given so freely, the loyalty she had carried so proudly, now shattered into pieces. But even in her heartbreak, there was a flicker of strength. She did not confront him immediately. She did not scream or accuse. Instead, she began to plan, quietly and deliberately. The woman Daniel thought would always wait silently was now awakening to the truth. Isabella would not destroy herself to hold onto a man who had already let her go. For the first time, she began to imagine a future without him, not out of desire, but out of necessity. Vanessa had always been a dreamer, but her dreams were never small. From the moment she entered Daniel's orbit, she envisioned herself not just as a fleeting presence but as the woman who would one day replace Isabella. Every stolen moment with him, every lingering glance across a meeting table, fed into the fantasy she had carefully built in her mind. She pictured herself walking beside him at charity galas, her arm hooked proudly through his, dressed in gowns that sparkled beneath camera flashes. She imagined the envy of other women, the whispered compliments from society's elite, and the taste of power that came from standing at the side of a man like Daniel. To her, Isabella was nothing more than an obstacle, a porcelain doll with elegance but no fire, a woman who had grown complacent in her role as the perfect wife. Vanessa convinced herself that Daniel was bored, that he needed excitement, and that she was the antidote to his mundane life. Whenever he looked at her with even a fraction of desire, she clung to it as proof that she was winning. She told herself that he would eventually choose her, that the wife waiting at home could never compete with the thrill she provided. But the reality was far different from the fantasy she indulged in. Daniel's moments with her were passionate but fleeting, a hidden indulgence he tucked away from the rest of his life. He never promised her the future she longed for, never spoke of leaving Isabella, never mentioned replacing one woman with the other. To Daniel, Vanessa was an escape, a secret fire he could stoke when the weight of his world felt heavy. He enjoyed the attention, the ego boost, the thrill of being desired by someone bold enough to chase him. Yet, when morning came, he always returned to Isabella's world, the stability and respectability he had built with his wife still anchoring him. Vanessa pretended not to notice. She silenced the doubts that crept in when Daniel failed to return her calls, when he cancelled plans with the excuse of business obligations, when she saw his face plastered in magazines beside Isabella, smiling for cameras as though their marriage were unshakable. Each time, she told herself it was temporary, that he simply needed time before making the inevitable choice to be with her fully. Her ambition blinded her, convincing her that she was not just a mistress but a future queen waiting for her crown. And yet, cracks began to appear even in her own certainty. There were nights when she lay awake in her luxury apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering why he had not come. She scrolled through social media, pausing at photos of Daniel and Isabella attending events together, her stomach twisting with a bitterness she tried to disguise as determination. She told herself that love was a game of persistence, that all she needed to do was hold on a little longer. But in the quiet moments, when the perfume had faded and the thrill was gone, she couldn't ignore the nagging truth: Daniel might never give her what she wanted. For Vanessa, the line between fantasy and reality blurred dangerously. She lived in a world of make-believe where she had already won, while in truth, she remained in the shadows, desired, yes, but never chosen. And as much as she fought to deny it, the throne she coveted was not hers to claim, not yet. Isabella's silence was not the silence of weakness, it was the silence of strategy. The night she found the receipt, she did not rage, did not confront Daniel, did not hurl accusations across their grand dining table. Instead, she folded her pain neatly inside herself, as carefully as she folded away her evening gowns after each gala. She had learned long ago that power did not always come from loud words but from carefully chosen actions. And now, as she stood on the precipice of betrayal, she resolved that her response would not be tears, it would be quiet, calculated revenge. The very next morning, while Daniel hurried off to work with the same distracted excuses, Isabella picked up the phone. She called a lawyer recommended by a trusted family friend, her voice steady as she requested a consultation. Sitting across the polished wooden desk from the attorney later that week, she listened carefully as he explained her rights, her options, the financial details of what a divorce would mean. She asked precise questions, her expression calm, though inside her heart trembled at the enormity of what she was preparing to do. By the end of the meeting, she had taken the first step toward freedom. The divorce papers were being drafted, and all she had to do was wait. Yet, to Daniel, nothing seemed amiss. Isabella carried on with the same elegance as always, hosting dinners, attending events, smiling for photographers. If anything, she appeared even more composed, her beauty radiant, her mannerisms graceful. No one could guess that behind those serene eyes burned the fire of betrayal turned into determination. When Daniel returned home late, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek. When he cancelled plans, she nodded and said she understood. And when he whispered half-hearted apologies, she smiled faintly, as though nothing in the world could shake her. But beneath that mask, Isabella was changing. She no longer cried herself to sleep. Instead, she poured her energy into preparation. She began sorting through documents, collecting bank statements, and organizing household affairs, all with quiet precision. She spoke to no one of her plans, not even her closest friends. Secrets, she knew, were most powerful when kept close to the heart. Every time Daniel looked at her and assumed she was still the same forgiving wife, she felt a strange satisfaction, knowing that the ground beneath his feet was slowly being pulled away, one silent inch at a time. What Daniel failed to see was that his wife was no longer waiting for him to return. She was rehearsing her departure, every detail carefully laid out. She imagined the moment she would place the papers before him, the shock in his eyes, the disbelief that the woman he thought too gentle to leave him had found the strength to walk away. That thought gave her comfort in the lonely hours of the night. It reminded her that even in betrayal, she was not powerless. At public events, Isabella played her role with such perfection that even Vanessa, who occasionally caught glimpses of her from afar, could not help but feel threatened. Vanessa saw a wife who looked untouchable, radiant, and adored, while she herself remained in the shadows, waiting for scraps of Daniel's attention. What she didn't know was that Isabella had already set the wheels in motion, that the woman she considered a fragile rival was, in fact, preparing to shatter both their illusions with a single act. The quiet strength of Isabella's revenge grew each day. She no longer begged for Daniel's love or sought his attention. Instead, she let him dig himself deeper into the illusion that she would always remain at his side. She laughed when required, played the gracious hostess, and posed for photographs, all the while carrying in her purse a secret that would soon upend his entire world. For Isabella, revenge was not about screaming or exposing him in public. It was about leaving him blindsided, broken by the very papers that symbolized the end of their perfect facade. And so she waited, calm and poised, her silence sharper than any blade. The day would come soon, she promised herself. And when it did, Daniel would realize too late that the wife he had underestimated had always been stronger than he ever imagined. Daniel stumbled into the house just as dawn was breaking, the sky outside painted with streaks of pale pink and gold. His tie hung loosely around his neck, his shirt wrinkled from the night he had spent tangled in Vanessa's embrace. He moved quietly through the hallway, hoping Isabella was still asleep, rehearsing excuses in his head. He would say the meeting ran late, that he had stayed at the office, that he had been too exhausted to call. He had used all of these lines before, and Isabella had always nodded, her eyes soft, her voice forgiving. He was certain she would believe him again. But when he entered the dining room, he froze. The table was already set for breakfast. A pot of coffee steamed gently beside 2 cups, slices of fruit rested neatly on porcelain plates, and Isabella sat there waiting. She was dressed in a pale ivory blouse, her hair pinned perfectly in place, her face calm in a way that unsettled him. There was no trace of tears, no anger in her eyes, only an unreadable serenity that made him feel suddenly exposed. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice steady as she poured him coffee. Daniel hesitated, his throat dry, but managed a nod. He sat down, trying to act casual, though the weight of her gaze made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. He began to mumble his excuse, reaching for the same tired script, but Isabella lifted her hand slightly, silencing him without a word. Then, with a grace that left no room for drama, she slid a folder across the table toward him. He glanced down, his brow furrowing as he opened it. The words stared back at him in sharp black print, "Petition for divorce." For a moment, the room went silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Daniel's eyes darted from the papers to Isabella, his mouth parting in disbelief. What is this?" he stammered, though he already knew. Her expression remained calm, her hands folded neatly on the table. "You've made your choice, Daniel," she said quietly. "Now I'm making mine." Panic surged through him. He tried to laugh it off, insisting she was overreacting, that things weren't what they seemed. He promised explanations, begged her to listen, but Isabella remained unshaken. There was no shouting, no pleading on her part, only silence and the faint curve of a smile that wasn't quite joy, but liberation. The more he tried to deny, the more desperate he sounded, and the clearer it became that she had already moved beyond caring for excuses. For the first time in years, Daniel felt powerless. He had always believed Isabella would endure, that she would forgive, that she would stay no matter how many nights he spent elsewhere. But the sight of those papers stripped him of that illusion. This wasn't a fight he could charm his way out of, nor a business deal he could negotiate. This was final. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back gracefully, her composure never breaking. "You taught me something," she said softly, her voice steady as she rose from her chair. "That silence speaks louder than words. I stayed silent long enough. Now it's my turn to be heard." Daniel sat there in stunned silence as she walked away, the divorce papers left on the table like a verdict he couldn't escape. The clink of her heels against the marble floor echoed through the empty house, each step a reminder that the woman he had taken for granted was no longer his. For Isabella, this was not the end, it was the beginning of her freedom. For Daniel, it was the morning his world finally collapsed. The news spread faster than Daniel could contain it. Within days of the divorce papers being filed, whispers turned into headlines. Society magazines that once praised the Hale marriage now printed scandal in bold ink. "Betrayal behind closed doors," one headline read, accompanied by a photo of Daniel and Isabella at their last gala together, smiling as though nothing had been wrong. Business associates began to distance themselves, wary of being linked to a man whose reputation was suddenly tarnished. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving, and calls from longtime partners went unanswered, their loyalty evaporating overnight. Daniel had built his empire on the illusion of control. Control of his company, his image, and his marriage. Now, that control unraveled thread by thread. Investors questioned his focus, rumors of his infidelity weakening their confidence in his leadership. Meetings grew tense, and even his most trusted employees avoided his gaze, their respect replaced with quiet judgment. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the sting of being on the outside, no longer admired but pitted, whispered about behind closed doors. At home, the void Isabella left was unbearable. The mansion that once buzzed with her laughter and warmth now felt like a hollow shell. The meals left untouched, the absence of her soft footsteps echoing through the halls, all served as daily reminders of what he had lost. He tried calling her, sending messages, even showing up at places she frequented, but Isabella never responded. Her silence, once his comfort, was now his punishment. Vanessa, the woman he had risked everything for, revealed herself in a new, unflattering light. When the affair was no longer a secret whispered in shadows but a scandal splashed across society pages, she stopped being charming and began demanding. She wanted more of his time, more of his money, more proof that she was worth the risk he had taken. Instead of soothing his turmoil, she added to it, pressing him to make promises he couldn't keep. She wanted the life Isabella had walked away from, but Daniel no longer had the strength or the reputation to give it to her. Arguments replaced passion, her sharp words cutting deeper than her once seductive whispers. Slowly, he began to see her for what she truly was, not a partner, not salvation, but a mirror of his own weakness. The fall was not sudden, it was agonizingly slow. Each day brought another reminder of how far he had slipped. Clients chose competitors, his wealth trickled into settlements and legal fees, and the empire he once ruled began to feel like sand slipping through his fingers. Even his reflection in the mirror seemed like that of a stranger, tired eyes, creased with regret, staring back at a man who had traded love for lust and lost everything in return. At night, when he lay awake in his vast, empty bed, Daniel thought of Isabella. He remembered her smile, her patience, the way she had once believed in him when no one else had. He remembered the dinner she waited for him to attend, the quiet devotion she gave so freely, and the way she had looked at him that final morning, calm, unshaken, handing him the papers that ended their life together. Regret was a heavy chain he carried now, dragging him further into the shadows of his downfall. Daniel had once been the man everyone envied. Now, he was the man everyone pitied. The fall of the millionaire was not marked by bankruptcy alone, but by the emptiness of knowing he had destroyed the only thing in his life that had been truly priceless. Isabella walked away from her old life with her head held high, her heart still bruised but no longer broken. The divorce papers had been her liberation, and though the process itself was painful, it also stripped away the weight of years spent in silence. She left the mansion behind, not with bitterness, but with clarity. That house had become a cage of loneliness, filled with echoes of unspoken words and broken promises. Now, she chose freedom. She moved into a smaller but elegant apartment in the heart of the city, where every detail reflected her choices, not Daniel's. For the first time in years, the walls around her felt alive, painted not with sorrow but with possibility. In the weeks that followed, Isabella poured her energy into rediscovering herself. She had always been known as Daniel's wife, the hostess, the quiet beauty who stood at his side. But now, she embraced her own identity. She returned to passions she had once abandoned, her love for art, her interest in charity work, her vision of building something meaningful on her own terms. Soon, she became a familiar figure at art galleries and cultural events, not as a silent accessory but as a woman who spoke with conviction and carried herself with undeniable strength. People noticed. Where once they admired her for her marriage, now they admired her for her resilience. Friends rallied around her, offering support she had not realized she had missed. Women who had once envied her life now confessed their admiration for her courage. "You've become an inspiration," one told her at a luncheon, and Isabella smiled, not because she sought praise, but because she finally felt the truth of it. She was no longer living in anyone's shadow. She had faced betrayal and chosen dignity, and that choice had transformed her into something unbreakable. Daniel's name still appeared in the papers, but always attached to words like scandal, loss, and decline. Isabella stopped reading after a while. She no longer needed to know how far he had fallen, because her life was no longer defined by his choices. The only memory of him she carried was the lesson he had taught her, that silence could be powerful, but when it was broken with courage, it could become freedom. One evening, months after the divorce was finalized, Isabella stood by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker like a constellation below. She sipped her tea and thought of the journey she had taken, from the woman who once cried into her pillow, waiting for a husband who would never return, to the woman who now embraced solitude as strength. She realized she was no longer waiting for anyone. Her life was her own, her happiness hers to create, and the future stretched before her like an unwritten canvas. She was not naive, she knew the scars of betrayal would always linger. But they no longer defined her. Instead, they reminded her of what she had survived, of the resilience she carried within. Daniel had lost her, but she had found herself, and in the end, that was the greater victory. As the city pulsed with life beneath her, Isabella whispered to herself a truth she had finally embraced. She was free, she was strong, and she was reborn.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.